chair of the history department. I'd like to welcome all of you to what promises to be a very exciting evening. I'd like to welcome Emily Rook Koepsel, who got her PhD here in 2010. She now has a position at the University Center for International Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And we will be discussing her book, Democracy and Unity in India, Understanding the All India Phenomenon, 1940 to 1960. And she will be in conversation with Patricia Lorsin, who is a professor of history at the department. And she is the author of, among other things, a book entitled Imperial Identities and Historicizing Colonial Nostalgia. So they will talk for 35, 40 minutes. And at the end, we will open it up to questions from the audience. The best way to do that is actually to put your questions in the chat and I will convey them. And either Emily or Patricia will answer your questions. So I think without any further ado, I will simply turn the screen over to Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Rook Koepsel. I know some of you are very friendly faces, and some of you I don't know. I'm really excited to come back to the University of Minnesota and talk a little bit about my book, Democracy and Unity in India, Understanding the All India Phenomenon, 1940 to 1960. It is based off of the dissertation that I wrote at the University of Minnesota, and so with a lot of changes. And so I'm going to just give a brief discussion of the book, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation largely focused on questions about democracy that I bring up in the book. And I'm looking forward to talking with you all as well. So the idea for the book and for the dissertation sort of came in two spaces. So the first one was in thinking about the way in which society and nation functioned, especially after colonialism, and thinking about India specifically, I was interested in the way in which sort of minority politics were often described, and Indian democracy was often described as somewhat uneven. So I was interested in thinking about how minority organizations and people who were trying to profess a minority politics in India were trying to think about themselves in terms of Indianness and where they fit within the nation. And the sort of less obvious sort of academic way that the thinking about this book and this dissertation came about was as I was doing research to think about this question about minority and how minority functioned in India at this moment of transition. One of the things I kept noticing was that everyone was an all India organization. So, you had organizations that are still all India organizations like All India Radio or the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. You also had smaller organizations like the All India Organization of Imams of Mosques and the All India Organization of Chemists and Druggists. And this idea of an all India naming strategy was extremely important in the 1940s, 30s and 40s in driving the way in which people were describing their political ambitions. And it didn't seem important, but the more I thought of it, the more I wondered how unity and democracy were functioning within some of these strategies about how we name and how we understand minorities. And so I began thinking about these things together, thinking about the idea of democracy and the idea of unity and how minority politics function within these modes. And what I came up with was that they had something to do with each other. And so that I argue in the book that because in because the Indian nation and the Indian state remained in flux through the 1940s and 50s, marginal political actors, writers, social activists, and others were able to propose novel forms of democratic participation and new ideas about what it would mean to be a unified state that focused on political responsibility, respect for difference, and a broader way of seeing the population. And the debates around these fundamental questions about democracy and about unity and about what India would mean for people who were not always the obvious majority, suggested a larger and hopefully more sustained conversation about these questions going through Indian political length of time, even to today. And I argue that while the strategies that the organizations that I look at, and in the book, I focus on two political organizations, the All India Scheduled Castes Federation, which was a political party that was representing the Dalit population in India, and the All India Women's Conference, which still exists, which was a social civil political organization that was representing women's participation in Indian society. And what I was arguing is that although the kinds of ways that these two organizations tried to define democracy, tried to define unity, tried to define Indian nationness as not enough by itself, as the majority by itself not being enough, weren't generally successful in the core of Indian political discourse. They remained part of the way in which Indians have talked about democracy and talked about unity up until today. Questions about the importance of dissent, questions about the way in which people protest, the way in which not quiteness is important, have continued through the political discourse today and are still part of the way in which things are being talked about. And this is more important than ever. You all, of course, read the news and know that that India has been having there's been a lot of questions about who belongs to the Indian democracy. So they're starting in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been questions about who is national and who is an anti-national voice in the Indian democracy, who can participate, how minorities need to participate in order not to be shameless, the way in which voice and activity can be read, how sort of defending oneself or others is read depending on minority status. And more recently, there's been a recent uptick in thinking about whose physical bodies and space in the nation matters. And recently we've had also this move about the wearing of the hijab and how that functions within the Indian society. So there's been a lot of continuing questions about what democracy means in India, who is part of the Indian nation, who is not quite Indian, but still participating in the Indian nation, and who is outside. And so I think a lot of the questions that I raise in the book about seeing oneself as part of the Indian society and also not part of the majority are really important. And I just want to say one more thing, because I know I've sort of rattled on and I don't want to go on too long, but one of the reasons why I focused this book primarily on women and on Dalit organizing in the 1940s and 50s is because in a lot of ways, these two groups, although minor in terms of power, they were seen as marginal to political society. We're making an argument about their importance as not quite majority participants in the society. And so, but this was something that the majority did not want to accept. So I talk about these two groups as internal minorities whose access to minority politics was often questioned and denied. And that is still the case, that there is a real denial of even the ability of minority groups to have politics in the same way that people who are more sort of recognizable as political actors are. So I'm just going to stop there. I hope I've made some sense. If not, I hope you ask questions.
Right, should I start then?
Sure, yep.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you, Emily, on your book. I really enjoyed it. And although I'm not a specialist of India, there were so many aspects that made me think about the larger picture of democracy and how it played out or plays out in different places. That is really what I want to focus on. I'm not going to start by defining the meaning of democracy because that'll take up far too much time. Instead, what I want to do is to mention a few of the questions and topics that came to my mind as I was reading the book, with a view to starting a conversation, not only on Indian democracy, but also on democracy writ large, and unity, of course. So first then, in countries with large surface areas and multiple cultural and social affiliations, whether these are of ethnicity, caste, religion, race, or gender, is true or complete democracy really possible? Reading about the way the Dalits and the women struggle to become part of the emerging Indian democracy made me wonder to what extent democratic unity is really possible in a very large country. There are always groups that fall by the wayside or don't take part, whether because consciously they don't like the politics or inadvertently because they're doing other things or not interested, or else by political maneuvering, which is usually the main way. And if one looks closer to home, for example, isn't redistricting and other attempts to curtail the vote in the US divisive and anti-democratic, in that they're geared to hinder or eliminate certain groups from voting and hence from participating in what is supposed to be the prime example of representative democracy? So in India today, there are, as you mentioned, some Dalits, Muslims, and women who are still excluded from the vote. I remember reading an article in Foreign Policy when the May elections took place. I think it was in 2018. And I read that 120 million people were excluded from the vote. Well, I was amazed because that's nearly 1.5 times the population of Great Britain. But then when you think of the population of India, which is, I think it's 1.3 or 1.4 billion, it's, proportionately, it seems to be, it doesn't make sense, but it's understandable. And more recently, the BJP's anti-Muslim rhetoric has been adopted by other parties. So is this going to lead to increasingly undemocratic developments? In other words, will it consciously or subconsciously marginalize targeted groups in the mind of voters? So is there always a subconscious or a rhetoric that certain politicians use that sort of create ways of excluding certain voters? So that's one of the sort of main groups of things that I was thinking about. The second thought that came to mind was about the time frame of democratic struggles. Emily focuses on the decades immediately before and after independence as the time of extraordinary turmoil in India. This made me wonder whether the impetus for the establishment of democracy in whatever shape or form usually comes after a political, social, or confrontational upheaval. Historically, of course, you can think of the United States and France. Those are some obvious examples, but also the upheavals of decolonization, which are more recent ones. In all these cases, there was some form of confrontation. So does that increase the idea of democracy or reinforce it? And the nature and upheaval of the nature of the upheaval and the society, the sort of form of society also shapes the way democracy does or doesn't develop, surely. and looking at the various forms of government that emerged after decolonization. Some of them followed the route of democracy and others that of autocracy. So why was this so? And in relation to this history, the history of the country is also relevant. Recent scholars such as the Indian economist Amartya Sen, I hope I'm pronouncing it the right way, and the British anthropologist Jack Boody have argued that democratic ideas were developing in the Middle East, India, and China long before democracy took root in the West. So what does this mean? Has that had an impact on India, for example, in the way in which things have developed in India? Yeah, go ahead. I have one final thing.
Go ahead, you do your last.
You respond to that. I think that's important because it was something that made me wonder.
One of the things I want to sort of talk to both of those two things together because and I was thinking about it because one of the things that happens in the 1940s is there really is a settling on the idea of democracy as necessary. Democracy functions as this necessary term for nationalism across a large segment of the political arena, including people you wouldn't necessarily think of as Democrats, and small d, of course. But one of the really interesting things about this accepting of democracy as sort of a shibboleth of the Indian national movement is that it also allowed for the idea of the term to be relatively fluid, that there wasn't a really clear sense of what a true democracy would be. And so you end up with people really taking to heart this idea that that this is a moment where democracy is necessary but unformed, that there isn't necessarily this true idea of it. So you end up with for example, in a newspaper article in the Dawn newspaper, which was roughly associated with the Muslim League, the Minority Corner asking the question, is an Anglo-Saxon version of democracy appropriate for India? And what would it mean to have an Indian democracy? You had the Dalit leader, B.R. Ambedkar, who also wrote the Constitution, in his speech to the Constituent Assembly as they're getting ready to ratify the Constitution, saying, if we do this, we have this idea of a democratic framework, and if we go through with just a democratic framework without fleshing out what democracy could mean in a social way, what democracy could mean in a larger way, then we're essentially going to be doomed to failure, that this absolutely will not work, that democracy in which we think of one person, one vote, one life is not a way to think about a society, a social democracy. And you had sort of, even as far into the independence as 1954, which is several years after independence, you had a whole set of talks on All India Radio, which, if there is a governmental mouthpiece in the 1950s, it's All India Radio. It really doesn't get any more center of the government than that, about rethinking Indian democracy. And you had a politician, a left-wing politician named J.P. Narayan, basically saying that Indian democracy has to be unfinished, that it is absolutely not good enough to have Indian democracy the way it is now, that it needs to be something that is uncomfortable with uncertainty. So when you started talking about this idea of a true democracy, one of the things that was really exciting to me and really fascinating in these early years before independence and after independence, when people still felt sort of comfortable with uncertainty, was this sort of push to change the way even the idea of democracy, which everyone accepted as necessary, could be pulled apart and put back together. And you have someone like Leela Gandhi saying that one of the really interesting ideas about a post-colonial democratic structure is that it's imperfect, is that there's this sort of unfinished imperfectibility about it. And one of my favorite, not to belittle, sort of go through this point too much, but one of my favorite quotes was by one of the Constituent Assembly members, Frank Anthony, who argued that he was talking about building the Constitution, and he said, that the Constitutional Committee had to go through a structure of what he called democratic manufactory, which he called argument, counter-argument, controversy, accommodation, forbearance, recognition, and then argument again. So it's this whole constant pulling apart. So I wanted to sort of set that in. That, in fact, one of the things that I think is most hopeful, and one of the things that worries me as I see it being evened out, is this constant push that there has to be more, that there has to be another step that can be taken, and that the reason for continued argument, even in the face of danger to one's own life, is that there is more, that there could be more, that there could be another step, that the dissent is functioning for more than just nothing. So I wanted to say that, and this is not everyone. I mean, this is very much a bit of a minority point. You had people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the Constituent Assembly. He was the head of the All India Muslim League and became the first president of Pakistan. He called the Congress and the majority party in India a brute majority. And there is also, in addition to this more hopeful mode, there is a very strong push where democracy means the majority rules and everyone else refers there and then gets what needs to be gotten. And I think that's a less hopeful mode, and it's one that we see coming up more and more often. And then I did also want to just jump in, because you were talking about sort of when does democracy happen, and you were talking about the idea that democracy is something that is sort of been brewing in India for a really long time. And in fact, this is one of Nehru's big arguments about democracy. And not just Nehru, it's actually one of the big arguments that gets made over and over again in pamphlets and in everywhere, in books, in newspaper articles, everywhere, this sort of trend toward democracy where India is actually defines itself as a democracy from all time. And I think Nehru said something like, the whole of India's past is witness to the fact that we stand in for democratic institutions. So you have this idea, and the way this structure is written, it pulls everything into the idea of the kind of democracy that gets put in place right at the moment of the Constitution. And this is interesting and it's useful, because one of the ways that it engages with some of the questions about what democracy means in India is that it drives sort of these ideas of democracy as kind of the spice in the Indian stew. These are the people who are adding in, but the general flow of history is what the majority is. And so in a lot of ways, the push for minority politics has been to say, hey, wait a second. It's not like India hasn't been democratic all this time, or if it has, it's been democratic in a way that is strongly exclusionary. What is actually needs to happen is everyone needs to be more recognizable, and there needs to be a dismantling of this narrative of gradual unity and Indian democracy-ness. But that said, it's an interesting point that there is this building of democracy, that democracy even in moments when it doesn't feel like it is managing, is an important underlying point in the national narrative in this moment. And it still has a little bit of it still has a frisson of that importance, that when you start talking about articles that come out which say, oh, well, India is becoming less democratic, that there's really a strong pushback against that in India. And there is some argument about why that is not really happening, even though I think it's pretty obvious that there are a lot of problems that are not being addressed in the most appropriately democratic way. Sorry, I didn't want to, I want to hear your third point. I kind of.
But I mean, that's really very interesting, because I mean, it's certainly not just to India that have these problems. And this is what my third point is about. But I was also fascinated about the way in which they think about democracy as a developing project, as opposed to one that's already been developed and is creaking for one reason or another. So my last point was just to talk about democracy in the 21st century now. I just wanted to make 2 points here. And one of them is this notion of trying to impose democracy on a country with different political and social traditions. And here I'm thinking of the rhetoric that accompanied the invasion of Iraq, which had catastrophic repercussions. But what I wondered was, if you think it can be achieved in less fraught circumstances. I mean, that was in the context of a war, but are there circumstances when the imposition of democracy in a slow, gradual process, rather than saying, well, here we are and democracy has arrived at last, whether it can be achieved? And finally, I suppose I can't stop without referring to the horrors of that are engulfing Ukraine. Yeah. And one of the most interesting aspects to me has been the way in which the Western democracies, many of which came in for really serious criticism for the waning of their ideals in the face of global capitalism and corruption, have come together in the face of a threat, which again makes me wonder about this notion of threat, the relationship of threat and confrontation to democracy. So does threat in any form, can it harden the desire to maintain or even just to introduce democracy or to achieve one's own brand of democratic governance, as you've just been arguing here? I think that was really very important. And then again, the question is how big does the threat have to be? And does that again depend on the circumstances? So I'll just stop there and give you a chance to respond to that or to anything else, and we can talk a bit more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually one of the interesting, I feel a little frightened by the question of, can you impose democracy? I have no idea, but I do think the thing that I would want to sort of say to questions like that is that the underlying thought behind questions like, can a country or a space impose democratic ideals or democracy on someone else, is that it assumes a specific thing called democracy. And I think I wonder if that, well, I wonder about the democratic function of that sort of, but also I wonder about what, I mean, part of the point I want to make in my book, and part of the sort of the reason why I wanted to end the book as I did with great trepidation, with thinking about a couple of modern day modern day minority political democratic movements. One of the reasons why I wanted to do that and why I think it's an important line is that I think that politics only function well when they are a negotiation between the people who want to engage in them. And they don't function well when they are ill understood or something that is not part of the way in which the people who are supposed to be engaging in the politics understand the world. And so I think, you know, as with anything, having people understand and redefine the terms of politics is the important way that something like democracy becomes a force that we would want to necessarily impose, and therefore kind of can't be imposed in a meaningful way. So, but I do think that that doesn't mean that we can't encourage politics of negotiation or politics of engagement among people, because there are people who want to engage in politics. I want to say, you know, one of the things that really changed my life, and I know that Simona is here, so I hope I don't embarrass her, but one of the things that really changed my life and my scholarship was when I was talking with Simona Sahani, and she put to me this question that, what is the politics behind the work that you're doing? Why is it important? I see Julietta is smiling here because I know that this is important to her too, I think. Why is it important? What does it say? And what does it mean? And I think that that really changed the way in which I think about how to write and think about history, because I think that the meaning, the politics of it, the way in which the goals that you have for what your engagement is are really necessary. And so if I were to say anything about the goals that I had when I was working on this book, it was in thinking about a world where it feels like the things that I care about, the sort of democratic politics that I care about, are on the wane, where people can't engage, where minorities are being brutally often left to the wayside or separated or silenced. What are the pieces that I can think about that are still part of our political negotiation? So what are the things that stay, that help to make sure that some of those politics that I care about can still be pulled? And so, you know, the things that I found in this book and that I tried to look to are things like a demand for not just sort of resource distribution, but recognition of a messiness of minority politics, recognition that, you know, there's a lot of different ways that people engage. And one of the reasons why I look at the Scheduled Castes Federation is that there is, in the way in which they set themselves up, there is a recognition of the fact that they're claiming to be representing a constituency that is well beyond them, that is well beyond anyone, that is plural in every possible way, and that they are sort of representing, but also recognizing the insufficiency of representation. And that's one of the things that I wanted to pull out when I'm thinking about the way in which the All India Women's Conference worked on women's politics and worked on understanding women's spaces in the nation. One of the things I really wanted to make as part of the argument was this sense that that women and minorities are not just auxiliary to a larger discourse, that there is a push and a pull to try and ask questions and drive for responsibility and recognition of different kinds of voices. And so, I think, and I wanted to think about the ways that these things are often tied together intersectionally. And so I think that was sort of one of the reasons why I ended the book where I did, was this hope that even in this moment where people were being, and still are, I mean, honestly, still are being put in jail for trying to represent Dalit voices, for trying to speak to dissent against the political party, that there is still some of these same questions about who recognizes whom, who understands what it means to be more than just oneself. And so I want to just say, like, that one of the women who was in charge of the All India Women's Conference at one point or another argued about the idea of this All India, which is the sort of the prefix for a lot of these organizations, that they were both all, that obviously All India Women's Conference wasn't necessarily all of India, nor was it all of the women in India, but that it was one part of all of India, and that it was part of India in the same way that India existed differently for everyone. And I think that is one of the things that we still see as part of the push towards fighting and dissent, that there is still some of that argument. And I worry, especially with changes in the way in which the media are running and the way that people are being jailed and silenced. I worry about some of these threads that have been so robust, even if they haven't been the loudest voice in the room, kind of disintegrating.
I just want to say just one thing, that what you're talking about now just made me think about. I think there's a tension between the ideals of democracy, the notion of participation or participatory democracy, where people get involved, and the notion of representative democracy. Yes. And I think in any large country in particular, you have those tensions that play out in some form or other.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's worth thinking very hard about, because a lot of organizations in India around this time and still today have this weird moment where they're making this argument about being a representative for a large group of people, and then being the sole representative for that constituency. And it is a complicated thing. And I think you're right that this question of representation and participation often run outside of each other's sphere. And it's a question that I'm still not sure that I know how I want to answer. And certainly a lot of the organizations that I worked with did not know how to answer and didn't have a good answer for it.
Well, there seem to be a lot of questions for you, Emily. So
yeah.
Can you see the chat?
Yeah, I can. So, and do you want me to start reading these, or? I think you're muted.
Yeah, she's.
See, I've never done Zoom before. Yes, I you could tell that by my gesturing that I was speaking. Like, so Kay Ryerson wants to know if you can give some examples of earlier strands in Indian history that may have fostered democracy or led to democracy.
Sure. So, I mean, the modern Indian history is often talked about in terms of sort of the thinking about the colonial period. And there are a lot of people who have written about pre-colonial democratic organizing in India. I'm not great there, but certainly there have been movements in southern India where there was a more sort of democratic appeal. I'm not great, but I will say that one of the things that I would want to sort of point to for earlier democratic strands that can be sort of talked about and that are very often talked about are thinking about the ways in which sort of regional politics worked in India before and during the Mughal period, so that there was a lot of different ways that societies were organized, that people sort of interacted with one another. Certainly in the 1940s and 50s, there was a lot of writing about village panchayats, village sort of governing bodies and the way in which those functioned as democratic precursors. I feel less comfortable saying that I believe that to be true, but that was certainly the sort of narrative that was put forward. But I think that the idea of democracy sort of in the way in which it's talked about in the 1940s comes from a lot of the movements and organizations in local ways. So, you know, a lot of these larger movements that I end up talking about, that I sort of feel comfortable with, are picking up on locally organizing movements. And in fact, the All India Women's Conference is really, at least initially, sees itself as kind of an umbrella organization where it's pulling different kinds of membership from around the country of groups who are doing just all sorts of different things in women's politics. And I think that is, if I'm thinking about it, that's where I want to look, is sort of a more local way in which people are organizing civilly, people are organizing their politics around other questions. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that it's often talked about in these, what I like to call the Indian civilizational lecture, is that there is, which people would stop me on the street to tell me about, is that India has always been democratic, that people talked with people, that there was a love and whatever, and the small village organizations. And I'm not sure that that's where I think it comes from. I think that's not my bag, but I think it's an interesting idea.
Oh, thank you. Simona says it's wonderful to see you and hear about your book. Do you think the push towards a stronger center in the early years of the Republic has proved to be a mistake? This is something that keeps coming up in current debates, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I have thoughts. I don't think it had to have been a mistake. I think one of the problems is that a push towards a stronger center, and you could see how this worked, meant that there was more ways to push people aside, to make it so that there was less opportunities at local and regional levels to make changes and to rethink how democracy worked. And when you think about movements in the late 40s and 50s through the 60s and 70s, where you had groups who were like, I mean, I hate to say like Naxalbari, but also lots of others, where people were trying for different kinds of modes of representation and participation that were easily crushed by the center. I do think that makes a bit of an argument that there is an interesting and um, and more progressive sometimes and more inclusive sometimes energy that can come from smaller organizing. On the other hand, I do think that, if you look at some of the stuff that happens right after independence, regional organizing wasn't always great. I mean, there were a lot of regional movements that were trying to be more exclusive and exclusionary, and so and where people were getting stuck, and so I think, in my mind, I think that there's a lot of protection to be had by a strong state, but that protection comes at the price of nimbleness and of progressive kinds of politics. And so I think that there were, if I had it to do over again, I think I probably wouldn't have necessarily kept as much strength in the state as ended up happening. And indeed, there are some things that very much I feel like you can sort of trace back to that move to strengthen the state. I'm thinking about changes in the fundamental freedoms clauses in the Constitution that limited people's ability to engage, and the strengthening and then codifying of emergency provisions like the Defense of India rules that really structured dissent as not as appropriate to India as it had been. And those, I do, when I think about that, I do think that the strengthening of the center has maybe done more harm than good.
So Ajay has a very interesting question. Can you say a bit more about the tension between all India and the fact that in many of the examples you deal with, it is minoritized groups who are claiming the moniker of all India?
Sure. I feel like that might have been a plant.
Well, that's okay.
So yeah, I think that it was very often minorities who claimed this, and I think that in a lot of ways it was claimed specifically because there was a push for minorities to grab this, to grab a space in specifically Indian politics. And so one of the things that I say in the book is that the most vocal sort of defense of all India comes from Chador Remit Ali, who is really anti all India, the all India prefix. And what he says, he was actually the first person who came up with the name Pakistan, and he had this idea that that this move towards all India was something that would really harm minority organizing. And he says, he said, quote, "Now this preposterous prefix of all India affixed to the names of organizations meant that, if it meant anything at all, that though they were Muslims, Sikhs, or Rajputs, yet they were Indians." And so that is actually, I think he was saying, oh, these people are all duped, that they're allowing themselves to get drawn into Indianness and losing their Sikhness, Muslimness, Rajputness, etc. But I think that for the minority groups that were claiming this identity, this all India identity, it functions as both a commitment to their constituency and a commitment to the nation, with the idea that you needed both in order to have an all, that there was a necessary both tension and engagement in these two ideas. And so the project of building an all India that would encompass all the people was an important part of the way in which they understood their claims. And so it was in a lot of ways more important for groups that were trying to claim both the necessity of say, scheduled castes people, and also the necessity of an India in which they lived, that they were both part and also their own, that their being part didn't mean that they weren't also themselves. So I think, yeah, it's one of the things that I really found interesting in the naming of this. And I think one of the reasons why the name has sort of still stuck around in India today.
Can I just go back to what Kay asked about the emergence of democracy? And I was very interested in what you said about the fact that it was, they referred to the villages.
Mhm.
And that is, in a village, you can have participatory democracy where everybody participates. But once you get to a country, that's much more difficult, unless, of course, it's France, where everybody's in the streets the whole time. But so, you know, looking back, for people looking back to the past, this notion of a village participating in the way in which the village is run, the whole village, I mean, that's participatory democracy, as opposed to representative democracy, where you can't really have that sort of participation without having serious disruption.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I said that I was somewhat, that I look at these claims about village democracy with a sort of fisheye is, you know, is that the people who are claiming this as a sort of democratic heritage are not seeing the way in which the exclusions happened in that kind of participatory democracy. I mean, functionally, in Indian villages, there were and are and continue to be a lot of people who were either landless or who were attached to the large landholder who were not speaking but being spoken for, and a lot of people who were part of a village but weren't seen as part of that village. And so so for a lot of reasons, I feel like this is, it's sort of an imagination of a pure democracy that also at the same time is imagining out the people who get excluded in addition. And in fact, one of the really interesting things that I still am not sure that I fully understand is the way in which especially the Scheduled Castes Federation, the All India Scheduled Castes Federation, talked about village life and village democracy, which they did. One of their very first, one of their most important movements was in trying to change village life for peasant Dalits. And they talked about the need for reframing villages and shifting Dalit residents outside villages and into other kinds of settlements. I'm not entirely certain what the village groups felt about this, and in fact, the Kisan party was not excited about working with the Dalits on this. But it's an interesting move that they made, because I think that they were looking at this narrative about Indian village democracy and seeing how that kind of description really moved Dalits out of the picture of democracy in a fundamental way.
Well, you know, we have now pretty much filled an hour with really wonderful and interesting and stimulating conversation. So I'd like to thank the two of you and everyone who came and everyone who asked questions. We are meeting, the next time we are meeting is April 6th, and Kaylee Horan will be talking about her book, which is called Insurance Era Risk Governance and the Privatization of Security in Post-War America. And she will be in conversation with Ben Wiggins, who is not a history PhD from Minnesota, but he's an American Studies PhD, and he is the digital humanities librarian. And I believe you will be getting an email tomorrow from Clayton, which will have information about the link to the recording if you want. And it will also have information on how you can donate to the University of Minnesota History Department if you should be so moved. And I really do want to thank you. And if anybody wants to hang around a little bit and talk, I think I'm a co-host and I can stay for a while and support conversation. So thank you all very, very much.
Thanks for coming.